Will you pray with me? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I love the Psalms. They are poetry. They are music. They speak to us in a place that words alone cannot take us because they are written in the language of our souls. I find myself turning to the Psalms in times like these because much of reality right now seems too difficult and too frightening for just plain, ordinary words. And yet the Psalms speak a truth that is eternal. Things like, the Lord is my shepherd, nothing shall I want. Or the earth is the Lord and the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Or as we heard today, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. As I mentioned at the beginning of worship, today we begin our annual stewardship season. This is that time each year when the session sets the church budget, and then we make a specific monetary ask. This year, it's to maintain your 2020 pledge, or to make a pledge if that's something you've never done before, and then to give as generously as possible to our capital campaign to replace our roofs. But it's more than just a money talk time. This is also a season when, more generally, we stop to consider who God is and what it means to follow Jesus, to think about who we are as a church and how we can dedicate our time and our talents and our treasure to God. Each year we choose at this church a theme to guide our stewardship reflections, and we have fun with it. And this year, rather appropriately for 2020, the stewardship team has chosen the theme, ever-changing normal, never-changing God. Which is all well and good, except that in the last few days, I've started to feel like ever-changing normal is a bit of a euphemism. I think it puts it all a little bit too gently. If you ask me, much of life these days feels much more like utter, uncontrollable chaos. Which is why I go to the Psalms. We don't know what was going on in ancient Israel when someone put pen to paper and wrote the song that we know now as Psalm 46. But it sounds like chaos. Listen to the scene the author describes. The mountains shake in the heart of the sea. The waters roar and foam. The nations are in uproar. Kingdoms totter. The whole earth trembles. But that's actually worse than it sounds, because for the ancient Israelites, the mountains shaking and the seas roaring was not just your run-of-the-mill earthquake or tsunami. No, this for the Hebrew people was the chaotic breakdown of the entire natural world, the end and destruction of all life. You see, the ancient Hebrews believed that the universe was made up of three levels. In the middle, there's the earth, where we live. Life can be hard, but more or less, God is in control. But above and below the earth are the waters of chaos. In the beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, God pulled back the waters of chaos from the earth into the sea below and the sky above. And then God set up the mountains the pillars of the earth, to hold that watery chaos in place. But always, according to the ancient Israelites, there was that threat that the waters could close in again. So when the psalmist sings about the mountain shaking, the waters roaring and foaming, they're painting a picture of a world on the verge of collapse, on the brink of destruction. Chaos is closing in. The world is hanging on just barely by a thread. And yet, the psalmist says, God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, even when the world seems about to collapse, we will not fear. We don't have to share that three-layered view of the universe to envision a world on the verge of collapse, do we? We too can feel the waters of chaos closing in. COVID infections surge back up. Political tensions follow suit as the election nears. Fires, droughts, hurricanes. I don't need to tell you what the chaos feels like because you are living it. The psalmist doesn't deny the chaos. We can't pretend it's not there. The psalmist simply sings what she knows to be true. God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the mountains shake, we will not fear. Though the waters and the nations roar, we will not fear. Though the earth should change, we will not fear. Though chaos closes in, we will not fear. Though COVID cases rise and we cannot see one another face to face, we will not fear. Though our church launches a major capital campaign and building project in economically uncertain times, we will not fear. Though we and our loved ones have fragile health, are sick, and encounter our own mortality, we will not fear. Though we live in an ever-changing normal that some days just seems to go from bad to worse, we will not fear. It's not that the chaos isn't real. It's just that God is there. And God is our refuge and our strength and our help when we're in trouble. We have faith in the goodness of this never changing God. This stewardship season, members from our church community will be sharing brief stories and reflections of where in these difficult times we've seen the presence of our faithful, unchanging God. And I want to close this morning by telling you a little story of my own experience of God's unchanging faithfulness. Back at the beginning of this year, before COVID was a household word, our property team was at the table making plans to replace the roofs of our church buildings. We've known this project was coming for a while. This is, of course, the project that we are now beginning, the reason that today we launch a big old capital campaign. Of course, between those initial meetings and today, a lot has happened, including water damage from a September storm, and as if 2020 didn't have enough to offer us, mold. And of course, there's COVID. COVID has changed not only life as we know it, but church as we know it. And though we have still faithfully met for worship every single Sunday, we have not been able to hug one another and hold one another's hands and see one another face to face. And it's not just worship that has changed. Mission has had to look different. Those of you who work with Shared Table or the Men's Shelter have seen that. Fellowship has had to look different. And God only knows that giving and stewardship and just running a church and getting through the day have looked so entirely different. We have had plenty to fear. And yet, we all, as a church, have continued to give faithfully of our time and our talents and our treasure, that's our money, to our church and to our community, even as our worlds and our church spending patterns have been turned upside down. Our mission activity has increased. And because of that faithfulness, something else entirely unprecedented has happened. As we start this project, we actually have the money in our bank account right now to pay that initial roofing deposit out of pocket without dipping into savings. Friends, I don't know quite how to explain to you that never happens. Ask any session member or former treasurer of this church. We operate at a break-even budget. We never have more than a few couple $1,000s in the bank. Sometimes it's more like 300. We do not run a surplus at First Presbyterian Church of Taos. But this year we have. And now we have the funds that we need to start a project that we need to finish before winter. Sure, we've still got a ways to go. A ways to go to finish and pay for the roof. We've got a ways to go to get through this pandemic. Whatever happens on election day, we have a ways to go to infuse the life of our nation with love, justice, and compassion. We've got a long road ahead of us and a lot of work to do. But God is our refuge and strength. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the mountains should shake, though the earth should change, though the world as we know it be turned upside down, we need not fear. God's got this, y'all. We are going to be okay. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.